Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and this episode is going to be a solo cast, and I want to talk about the top lessons from 2020, specifically for spiritual leaders and for spirituality. These are my lessons, but I'm trusting that they're going to be helpful for you. And this is some of the things that I learned in 2020 that have impacted my life that I'm going to carry into the next year. The first one comes from early in 2020, and my own coach introduced me to a concept from Bernard of Clairvaux, and this comes out of his sermons on the Song of Songs. And in one of the sermons, Clairvaux talks about the importance of ministering as a reservoir instead of a canal. And what Clairvaux means by that is a reservoir in his day, that's obviously a storing mechanism for water so that people have access to fresh water. And in those days, those would have oftentimes been at the top of a hill where you would dig out a pond or something that's going to hold in the water. And for Clairvaux, the key characteristic of ministering as a reservoir is that you're not drawing the water down in the reservoir, but you're creating a reservoir that then overflows. And so we serve by being so connected to God and so committed in our spiritual formation that there's an abundance of grace in our lives that allow us then to be truly ambassadors of God's abundance out of the overflow in our lives. Because there's a danger, and wherever you are in your walk and in following Jesus, but this is often especially true of pastors, is that the opposite of being a reservoir, Clairvaux says, is to minister as a canal. And what Bernard of Clairvaux meant by a canal in those days, again, I grew up in Northeast Ohio, so I lived literally a block from the Ohio Erie Canal, which was this continuously flowing stream of water that was designed to connect Lake Erie with, I think, the Ohio River ultimately. And so when I think of a canal, I always think of this, well, there was a channel that was full of water. Well, Clairvaux doesn't mean that. He means a channel that's only full of water after a storm or after the winter snows melt and the water just races through these things. We might think in the modern language a storm sewer. They're dry except for when there's a storm, and then they flow really quickly. And the danger from a spiritual perspective is essentially the second we get something from God, we immediately share it with someone else. So we're always depleting ourselves in the good, with the good intention of serving other people. So for example, Clairvaux actually specifically says, look at the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, oftentimes we make the mistake of loving our neighbor more than we love ourselves. So one of the lessons that I had gained from 2020 was the importance of being a reservoir. So as I look towards 2021, reservoir is going to be my word for the year. And I'm asking myself, what would it look like a year from now for me to be serving as out of that position of being a reservoir? What practices do I need to put in place? What do I need to learn? What do I need to stop doing? Those are key questions. Otherwise, it's essentially, I take a breath and I immediately breathe it right back out. That would be more of a canal. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson I got early in 2020. This would be around March, right when the pandemic happened and it looked like it was going to be a terrifying time. The economy closed down. We were all put in, well, depending where you lived, we were put into various self-isolating positions. Businesses were closed down, and it was scary times. And I had the privilege of listening to a video by strategic coach Dan Sullivan, and he talked about the concept he called KASH. And again, there's a play on words here. And he spelled KASH, K-A-S-H, because he said when our cash flow, or actually money flow, is threatened, it's important in those times to focus on KASH, which is something that we can control. And he uses an acronym. And so I thought this was a powerful principle. I applied it immediately to my own life right when the scary times happened. And it helped me to be in a position where I was able to serve more people in 2020 than I ever have previously. In fact, this Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast is a product of the overflow that I had by immediately applying this KASH principle from Sullivan. So what's KASH mean? KASH stands for K, knowledge, A, attitudes, S, skills, and H, habits. In other words, when it feels like we're in scary times, we focus on our own personal growth as an investment in the future that will come. And so some questions that I can ask myself around this KASH idea is what knowledge did I gain in 2020? What new attitudes did I develop? What skills did I learn that are setting me up for the long haul? And what habits did I embrace that would fuel me for both good times and bad times? And so KASH was a key learning. So every time you face a scary time, you can go into this KASH mode. Knowledge, attitude, skills, and habits. My word for 2020, interestingly enough, was curiosity. I wanted to learn. Again, I was thinking of a great phrase, again, from Dan Sullivan that I had learned right at the end of 2019, at the beginning of 2020. It was this: winning isn't always learning, but learning is always winning. Again, one of the key pieces of life, of the spiritual life, is to be curious. Be curious about what's going on around you. Be curious about how you feel. Be curious about what's going on inside your mind, what thoughts you're thinking. Be curious on how you're sensing your relationship with God is. And when we open ourselves up to the world, to God, to others with curiosity, our lives can become infinitely interesting. And we're essentially doing what? Opening ourselves up to learning, which is always winning because learning allows us to grow. When we're curious, not just about the good things that happen in our lives, but when we're curious also about mistakes that we make, problems that we fall into, even sins that sometimes beset us, when we get curious about those things, we can learn from them in ways that bring us increasing amounts of freedom and growth in what truly matters, which is growth in love for God and love for neighbor. So curiosity was a big learning for me, and I hope to continue to embody curiosity for as long as I get to walk on this earth. Lesson 4, silence and solitude practices. Boy, was that a critical piece for 2020. We all essentially became monks, right? We suddenly had to spend huge amounts of time isolated from other people, sometimes even isolated from extended family members. And people were struggling with loneliness. People struggled with sitting with their own thoughts. And so I'm super grateful that coming into 2020, I already had some robust silence and solitude practices. But what I did is I doubled down on those things, especially once the pandemic hit. I am a big advocate of centering prayer. You can go back to earlier episodes of the Deep Dive podcast, and I'll put some links down below where we talk about centering prayer. And also, by the way, I have a centering prayer book coming out in 2021 towards the end of 2021 with Paraclete Press. But big centering prayer practitioner. I do 20 minutes every single day for significant blocks, especially during when everything was closed down. I was doing 2 to 3 20-minute sessions of centering prayer every day and maintaining a robust journaling practice. Again, you can go back and listen to me talk about my journaling practice in earlier episodes. I believe you should go back and listen to episode 8, for example, to take a look at that. But what practices do you use in your life that fuel you and that you do essentially by yourself, not as an act of isolation, but to practice silence and solitude before God? That's what these are about. And so centering prayer, certain journaling practices, reading scripture, lectio divina, those are silence and solitude practices that can open you up for more of God's abundance and fuel you for those times when you do go back into the world and when the world opens up. We'll be talking more about silence and solitude as we move into 2021 with this podcast. The fifth lesson of 2020 for me came from my reading of a great book. It's not a Christian book, but it was a fantastic book called The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by, I'm not sure 100% sure how to pronounce this name. It's a Dutch name. He's a doctor, Bessel van der Kolk. And in case you're scared of reading a book by a doctor, this is one of the clearest scientific psychology books that I've ever read. Van Kolk was a medical doctor, he was a psychiatrist. He was a pioneer in helping to heal combat vets with PTSD, and then he began to work with other persons who had experienced real trauma. And 2020 was a year of trauma. We saw in the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that followed the killing of several African Americans by police officers, we really saw the some effects of when we talk about systemic racism. Part of that is actually the trauma that persons, and if you especially persons who are outside of the majority, have experienced, both maybe intentionally but also sometimes unintentionally by the majority, that have caused trauma that lives right underneath the surface. Now, let alone in our own lives, some of us have experienced PTSD, whether you were in a war or a victim of some kind of a crime, or even really psychological PTSD from abusive relationships. This was a fantastic book because what van der Kolk talks about is how our bodies hold into the trauma. Now, I've experienced certain levels of trauma in my own life, and I know that I have little spots around my body that in certain circumstances literally feel like I'm getting stabbed with a knife. And I always wondered what that was. And if you go back and listen to the episode that I did with Elaine Heath, she talks about trauma and how that can be embodied. And so this is a great book, and this was a great learning for me. And so we want to connect our spirituality with our bodies. And that's one of the things, sometimes we cut it off. Sometimes we have a Gnostic faith. We act as though we're not an embodied soul, but your spirituality is intimately connected with the physical body. Again, van der Kolk doesn't get into it in his book because it's a secular book, but it's interesting. Some of the things that he talks about that help to heal trauma are things like meditations, like centering prayer, journaling practices, certain kinds of bodily movements that we can make. And so it just underscores the significant role that our body actually plays in our spirituality. So you might just ask yourself right now, how is your body feeling? If you do like a body scan, and their solitude silence practice is what's known as welcoming prayer, where we just recognize how our body feels. What signals is your body sending you? Where do you have aches and pains? Where are your spots that kick up in certain kinds of circumstances or stressors? How's your diet? How's your exercise? All those things are critical for spirituality. So The Body Keeps the Score was a big lesson for me, and I'm thinking and continuing to think more about what's an embodied spirituality look like? How do I need to take care of the totality of who I am so that I can be fully able to live as God's hands, God's feet, and God's mouthpieces in the world? And the last lesson, in a sense, this is going to bring us back, in some ways, circle back to Reservoir versus Canal, but that's the practice of simplicity. 2020 really underscored the critical importance of recognizing what really matters and what are things that are just floating around on the peripheries. And so it's a life of simplicity. That's a simple spiritual practice. You can go back and listen to my conversations with Mike Voigts on simplicity and Gene Yatka, the very first episode of the Deep Dive podcast, to hear a little bit more about simplicity. Mike Voigts, early episode, Gene Yatka. Again, these will all be listed in the notes if you're interested. But simplicity invites us to look at all the things that we have in our lives and making an assessment to how much it serves our greatest growth in God's grace. So that may invite us to have practices of minimalism, for example, in terms of possessions. Allows us to potentially be more generous people because we don't need as much for ourselves. Simplicity is also about recognizing our limits and setting up margins in our lives. One of the things that was a blessing for me over the last few years is that I was able to, my wife and I, we were able to work to become debt-free. It was very important for us, other than just our housing payment. And then also along with that, because we weren't spending so much on stuff, we were able to build up, once we paid off our bills, build up a little bit of a savings account. So we had emergency savings, which, believe me, back in March and April when we really didn't know what was going to happen, it felt a lot better going into this scary time with knowing that we had some resources to fall back on than previous scary times. Like you can go back to the 2008 crash and the housing bubble blow up and all the things that happened there, or even the Y2K scare or the dot-com bust. There's been different sorts of recessions that have kicked in that I've experienced personally, but have been really hard. So just practicing simplicity in my acquisition of possessions, in my financial life, and even in my time, recognizing that I need to put margins and not try to have this complicated calendar, but focus on the things that matter most. This huge lesson for 2020, and in a sense, set me up to be, like I said earlier, to be able to serve and help more people. Allowed this podcast to emerge because I had some extra time and I was able to invest it in something that would be important, that hopefully can last for a long time. And hopefully this podcast will continue to create real value for you and give you some deep spiritual insights. So those are my lessons for 2020. What were yours? I'd love to hear about them in the comments. If you found this podcast helpful, really invite you to subscribe, tell your friends. If I can be of any service to you, reach out. The email for the show is deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. I also, if you'd like some help walking through some of your lessons, if you're interested in coaching, I specialize in coaching pastors. I have a program called Deep Dive Spirituality Group Coaching. You can check out deepdivespirituality.com for more information about that. And I also do general coaching. I also coach entrepreneurs and nonprofits, really specialize in Christian business owners. So if that fits you and you're interested, you can check out my website, drbrianrussellcoaching.com. Again, all these things will be in the notes. Thank you for listening. I look forward to serving you in 2021 as this podcast continues into its second calendar year. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope to others.